flowers. It had been a cold afternoon then. George had worn his new hat and a new grey suit. He was always a natty dresser. He'd stood amongst the graves, amongst the mourners who'd come from the community, with his hat in his hand. He didn't see her coffin lowered into the earth. He wanted to remember her, how they'd been in life. That was in 1946. Now, 12 years on, he'd come back to the churchyard. It was a bright winter's day. St. John's Church was the same. It was the oldest church in Richmond. The trees and grave markers familiar. Mazy's marker was a simple wooden cross with a small brass plaque. It was all they could afford. Though now, as he approached the grave, he hung back. Someone else was there, at the graveside, bending down. It was a man. He was in his 30s, and wore a shabby raincoat and one of those European peaked navy blue caps that George was so familiar with from his youth. The man looked German somehow, and George had an instinctive sense of recognition. George lingered amongst the trees. The flowers he had bought held bloom down awkwardly. The face was familiar. After 17 years, George recognized his own estranged son. What was he doing back here? To see her grave was evident, but had he come back for good? Did he want a reconciliation with his father? George hoped not, because he feared his son had not changed. The painful arguments over race and politics were bitter. Young George had despised the community in which his parents lived. The intermingling of blacks and whites, the music, the shared experience of parenthood, the getting along. That trip they'd taken to Mobile, Alabama in 1938, when George Jr. had been adopted by the Clemsons. They'd introduced him to the Klan. His beef had been about blacks. They had it in for Jews. Shortly after this, when they'd returned to Nashville, George Jr. had quietly slipped away to live with them. They had all but adopted him. Mazy never saw him again. The end was acrimonious. It broke Mazy's heart. She never got over it, and George Sr. never forgave his son. His talk of Hitler and the new Germany had sickened them. When the young man had gone, they thought he might have gone to Germany. When Mazy learned that her son had joined up and shipped out to England, she was proud, but George Sr. had his reservations. As far as he was concerned, his son was insane and capable of desertion, treachery, or worse. Now, seeing him for the first time since before the war, in a German coat and German hat, he wondered if his fears might not have been confirmed. He watched. The younger man placed second-hand flowers on his mother's grave. He stayed for another 20 minutes, 40 in all. He appeared to be talking to her. Then he got up, put his cap upon his head, and walked away. The father watched him go. He made no attempt to reinitiate contact, but waited until the man left the cemetery and hit the street outside. Then the elder George approached the grave. For a moment he thought about ripping up the sorry flowers placed there, but they were a son's gift, perhaps his only gift, and he owed that to Mazy at least. He placed his own flowers side by side with the others, paid his quiet respects, and he too left.